The world is on the brink of going boom boom.
And I have a confession to make. I went into Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep expecting a story that would be little more than an excuse to tell some tropey jokes and shoot up some jokey tropes. In my defense of that take, but not of that sentence, the trailer had already built this notion in my head, and after hearing the game's premise, the deal was sealed.
Well, our vault hunting buddies beat the slamma-jamma out of that Hyperion informant downstairs. I thought we could play a game. Now, pick your characters.
I stress, slamma jamma. You can imagine my surprise when I discovered this tiny 9-year-old DLC that was given out for free on every gaming platform known to alien and man had more to give than that. In fact, I would argue that this small, unassuming story accomplishes more than most we get nowadays, and it does so with surprisingly little. The only question is, what does it do, and how?
So, like I said,
shall we?
roll for initiative, suckers! I'm empty here. This is our most desperate hour. Unless we make a stand here and now, we're gonna die.
I, Roland W., a knight of justice and cupcakes, start punch the initiative.
Robot, attack mode!
As I mentioned, this story does a lot with a little, and I emphasize little because I can sum up the entirety of its events in less than 60 seconds. The world is plagued by darkness. The Queen ventures out to the Tree of Life in hopes of restoring the light and never returns. It is your job to find her, but the terribly evil and insufferably handsome sorcerer, who all along you thought to be an innocent yet extremely knowledgeable and oddly helpful gatekeeper, entirely deserving of your trust, has taken her prisoner. And so you shoot up a football stadium worth of enemies, get to the bad guy, fight the bad guy, kill the bad guy, kiss the princess, wait, sorry, it was a queen, and think to yourself, it's a me, ma, but opt not to say it because Nintendo and because it's weird to kiss unicorns anyway. Unless you go to Review, of course. However, the truth is a little more complicated than that. The truth is, I just lied to you. And that is not even the biggest confession of this video. You see, simple narratives in games are no more surprising than saying the Borderlands franchise is a series of first-person looter shooters that use wacky humor,
Has your palate experienced the genocidal bliss of my culinary warfare?
light character progression mechanics, and the odd puzzle to break the pace. No, the real surprise was this.
Come on, girl, you know we gotta wait for Roland before we start.
You see, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep was never really about any assault on Dragon Keep, and it was always about Tiny Tina. This game that she created, this role-playing session of B&B she masters for her friends, is Tolkien's favourite word, an allegory. The truth is that this game within a game, this story within a story that Tina is telling, is only a means to an end, and a mirror of things that have happened to these characters in the past. Things that the game will tell you from the start with this stylized PowerPoint presentation straight out of one of my college Zoom meetings. Now they say games are about escapism. More on that later. For now, I will say that given the strength of the dialogue and performances throughout, this slideshow was entirely unnecessary. It shows us the events that happened in the real world prior to this role-playing session taking place, all but one of which shall be contextualized within the narrative anyway. A group of vault hunters led by Roland stood up against a corporation seeking to rule over the Borderlands through a monopoly of iridium, a crystalline resource native to the planet of Pandora which does stuff. Paul Atreides can relate. The Vault Hunters defeated Hyperion and Handsome Jack, it's Jeff Bezos, actualizing every communist's most moisturized dream, but not before losing Roland in the process. He was shot in the back after the release, betrayal, and later redemption of Angel, Handsome Jack's daughter. This whole recap of the main game gives us all the information we need to understand what Tina is really doing with her story and some meta commentary we'll discuss later, so remember it.
Tina, Roland's not coming, right? He's not here anymore.
This is the emotional through line of the game and its true story, set up in the opening scene where we see a little girl in denial at the loss of a father figure and a bunch of grown-ups unsure or unable to handle the situation. A lot of storytelling mumbo jumbo can be thrown around here, including the mice quotient, but the important thing for us to note is the establishment of character arcs, of which there are two. Tina's, and as a whole, her friends. Both of these arcs will be dealing with grief, but where one will center around the individual, the other will center around the individual support group. It turns out that it's not just hard on the people dealing with loss to do so, but that it's also hard for those people closest to them. Lilith, Brick, and Mordecai make it clear that no Roland will be joining them. Still, Tina refuses this truth and deflects the topic, shoving the conversation aside and starting the campaign that I spent 30 seconds talking about earlier.
The queen is missing!
You gotta go find the queen. Except that the important bits about this secondary story are everything I left out. The two stories, Tina's fiction and our fiction of Tina's, are inevitably tied together. Within Tina's narrative, we shoot some stuff, and some more stuff, and some more questionable stuff, as we follow this totally not sketchy gatekeeper who somehow, without aid, makes it past the forest of being eaten alive by trees, previously known as the less exciting Forest of Tranquility, until we reach an impasse. Here again, Tina is insistent on waiting for Roland to arrive, as the game may not progress without him, much like she can't. Lilith tries to argue, but again, Tina only changes the subject, finding her own way to force Roland into her fiction when her friends will refuse his presence in her reality. Instead of him being a character playing with them in the room, he shows up as an allied NPC in Tina's campaign, who is particularly kind to us, the player character, and, as is remarked upon by Mordecai and Brick, does not speak quite like the real Roland would. It is almost as if Tina is projecting her idealized version of Roland into her story.
Roland doesn't talk like that.
He does when I'm voicing him, girl.
And so all the funny jokes and commentary on the gaming industry, all those invasive backstabs and unbalanced areas and questionably designed armor sets were really just a distraction from the choking reality of losing a loved one. But I'm forgetting myself. After all, Borderlands is science fiction satire. So let's go back to the right tone and remind you all what you're really experiencing with this story.
What are we looking for?
She's the most beautifulest woman in the history of ever. Shorty's got legs for days.
Wow, that was unhelpful. Tina? Tina!
Sorry, just thinking about them legs.
There, now we can be happy again. At least for a while. Roland, every woman's worst nightmare, the White Knight, helps us open the path to the Tree of Life, and our next shocking revelation. The Queen is still missing, and our helpful gatekeeper turns out to have been the handsome sorcerer all along. Who could have known that the butler did it after all? The White Knight helps us shoot some more skeletons in a slightly repetitive section where we have to defeat giant Superman some 7-ish times. Maybe this is what happens when the Man of Steel and Catwoman have a child. Anyway, let me jump ahead some Mines, Dark Souls and My Fair Lady references, Death Trap mixing up the fantasy universes, a bunch of maniacal side missions, and a tower so we can drop down this trap of Handsome Jack, of the Handsome Sorcerer, and land some 200 feet down in the dark, dank, rocky dungeons of this tower, harmlessly. The next important beat of the story will be here. Here is also where we will find the only scene necessary for the development of this story that is reliant on the information that was exclusively given to us in the introductory PowerPoint presentation. We follow a woman's voice as we shoot our way through enough corridors and rooms to bury all the tropes of the fantasy genre. There is a minor twist as we switch between hacking, smashing, electrocuting, incinerating, but always thoroughly obliterating the sorcerer's minions, and it's that the Queen, that voice we have been following like it's the hentai version of Preach, is not the Queen nor the princess. No, when we get to the source of this voice begging for its savior, it's not actually the Queen and them legs. Tina has set us up. It turns out that instead of a rescue, we get a boss fight. This is not the Queen, this is the sorcerer's daughter. And you see where the game is going with this? Once we defeat Chaos Witch Quelaag and discover that it, her release, as always, had been the sorcerer's plan all along to be stomped by his freak-ass daughter, Tina's friends who had begun to invest themselves in her narrative are pulled right out again. This is because the way they saw Angel's betrayal in real life did not paint her as a villain or the sole reason for Roland's death. In their real story, Jack's daughter Angel was a tragic character, one that might have not known better, that might have been afraid or manipulated by her father into betraying the Vault Hunters. But Tina cares about such excuses as little as she does about the existence of salads. To her, Angel was responsible. To her, she is to blame. To her, she was the worst.
If it weren't for her dumb butt, everything would have been fine and nobody...
So although the order may not be accurate, the events of their recent past are being relived in this fictional game that they are playing. Handsome Jack is still ruling over them, except that instead of a giant H-shaped spaceship up with the stars, he rules from his seat at the top of the tower. Roland leads the party of Vault Hunters to defeat Jack and save Pandora, or in this case, Flamerock Refuge, and we even get to free Angel. But Tina is changing the story. Because if the release of Jack's daughter is what led to Roland's death, then releasing and immediately defeating her would solve the problem. It would mean that Roland never had to die. This is not Tina borrowing from their shared adventure to tell her own, which is something all us storytellers do, but here it is Tina writing a fanfiction around their trauma about how she wishes it had gone differently. And the issue with this is twofold. On the one hand, she's not allowing herself to mourn, she's bottling all the emotions up and shackling herself to a past that is gone and a life that will never be again. And on the other hand, it is unfair to her friends who have their own grief ignored and invalidated by the denial of its reason for being. And you thought this video would be funny, did you? It's important to note though that the game is expertly written to be able to tackle these themes in such a way that the humour is never sacrificed, but that it enhances the delivery, adding nuance to the telling and preventing what I most hate in this world, melodrama. Then again, it might also be that none of this was ever the intent and it was all just a dumb excuse to shoot up some tropey jokes. We will never know. After the dungeons, Handsome Jack is done with all the games and calls us over and up to the tower where we will get the final fight, one that will reinforce all that has come before. You may be wondering how a man can call us in a medieval fantasy universe of swords and axes, but that would imply that you are also ignoring my character is literally holding a cursed submachine gun by the name of Bane right now, one that does this every time I shoot it. So how far-fetched is it really to assume that Gearbox made a deal with Tesla for the beta version of the Neuralink? Whatever the case, Handsome Jack waits at his balcony, and after a good solid week of hurtling mosquito bites at the man, coupled with a compulsory crash outside his elevator, he is finally defeated, and our white knight shows up again, Roland, with sunshine, rainbows and crumplets. He congratulates us, the player, Tina's friends that through us are playing, and Tina that through them is projecting herself, on defeating the villain, and they all live happily ever after. At least, that's what Tina would want.
And it was great at the end.
Enough! You can't just deny what Jack did to Roland.
Can't hear you.
The issue is that our little friend does not, at any point, get a free pass. For the most part, it's Lilith, but now all the characters will team up together. All of them will draw the line and make the call that it has been enough. Tina has gone too far. She cannot keep denying Roland's death and pretending that it never happened, that she could travel in time and magic it back to normal. It is not fair to him, it is not fair to them, it is not fair to herself. The first step towards fixing something is to know it's broken, and the first step towards healing is to know that you are.
Master.
You need to accept it. Roland is dead.
I know! But it's my story!
And finally we get our first break. Tina's storytelling stops, the villain is weak but not defeated, and Roland stands with his back turned to him, ready to receive his shot in the back, when Tina admits to his death and opens herself up to mourn. Up until this point, she had only barely been grieving, which means that she was subject to the pain of her loss, but there had been no process of coping, no beginning to mourning and moving on, because there is nothing to move on from if nobody died. Mourning is the process of coming to terms with the finality of life and how this will change your own, what you lose by losing others. It is a process that eventually, hopefully, leads to one understanding that there is a life to keep living and a relationship that, although changed by loss, is not lost. This acceptance is that key that Tina needed to unlock the path of healing, and you could argue that in her state, this key would not have been available without the pressure and insistence of her friends. Which brings us to the second conclusion to the story, the one that is not Tina's, but is tied to her.
You know what? It's okay. He doesn't have to go.
Not if you don't want it to.
At the same time as she accepts what has happened, the death of Roland, Tina's friends understand that this entire game that she is playing, this story that she has spun as a fanfic of her own reality, it's what she needs to begin healing. As opposed to escapism, which is what we usually use our stories for, Tina is using this game to deal with real life and her real grief, as a direct tool to manifest her emotions in a safe environment, one that also happens to provide her the emotional support that she may have thought lacking after the death of her father figure, and now comes in the form of her friends. When before Lilith, Brick and Mordecai were reluctant and sometimes even resentful of Roland's appearances in the narrative, this time they accepted, because they see the expression of feeling that Tina had so long repressed. They stop seeing her denial as an insult and start seeing it for the desperate defense mechanism that it is. And in their understanding, they grow too. Their pushback becomes itself a key, one that Tina needed to open that door behind which emotional processing and the establishment of a new life are possible, but also where the meta commentary on storytelling comes in, that which can be simplified in the cliched yet effective phrase, was it ever just a story? And although I still owe you all one last confession, this is how Tiny Tina's story surprised me. All that progression, all those subtle themes painted over by a shiny, thick, oily layer of funny with a U, were all told in 4 scenes. The opening, where Tina refuses to acknowledge Roland's death, finding Roland alive as an unplayable character in the forest, fighting Jack's daughter, who is so bad she looks like a literal spider, and then facing Jack himself, where Tina accepts the truth and her friends accept her trauma, allowing her this game as an avenue to begin coping. It took 4 scenes in a game that is only 4 hours long because of how much fun it is to shoot skeletons in the face. The game never broke its tone either, despite how hard it is to keep such a thing consistent in comedy, never resorted to melodrama, and never wasted my time, secondary fetch quests, the bane of my existence, aside. This small DLC from 9 years ago is somehow only now getting a sequel in a full AAA title, and considering how well the original holds up, I'm also surprised it took Gearbox so long to get to it. Yes, the game's graphics show their age, although less than others that do not share this stylized comic book aesthetic. Yes, it is annoying to get stuck in the level design while being chased by an overpowered 10-foot orc that craves to be your stepdaddy. Scary stuff. And yes, there are other interactions, plenty of them, between the characters, especially if you choose to engage with the game's 6 to 8 hours of side quests. But it only really takes 4 scenes for the story to walk us through its development. 4 scenes and the story is told. Not 4 seasons, not 4 sequels, 4 scenes. That's all, and enough. And it's how this tiny DLC of Tina's does a lot with a little.
Goodbye.
But I know that you have not forgotten, and I ask only that you can forgive. As I said before, I have a second confession to make, and this is it.
The truth is that there's a fluke to my arguments, a hole in the tapestry. The truth is that I may have found none of this surprising at all if I had ever finished playing Borderlands 2. I have sinned.
Maker, help us all.